extensive reading is extensive reading is always it's an interesting topic for me, because in a way it's so easy, in the sense that in order to do extensive reading, you just do extensive reading. You know, you get your book and you read it and that's it. And there shouldn't be a lot to it. And so when Rob and I worked on our book about the research on extensive reading, you know, in the early parts, I always had doubts about whether you're making something simple too complicated. But there is such a lot of interesting research about it that it probably is worth looking at all that research and so on. But it's always important, I think, to go back to the idea that it is something which is basically very simple, and we mustn't sort of lose sight of the simplicity of it. That's why when I was just talking to Atsuko a few minutes ago, the idea that in her class she simply sits down and lets them read, that seems to me to really capture the essence of what extensive reading is. Okay. I've got a definition of extensive reading, which you probably don't need, but it seems to me that we have to keep in mind what it is, and that is each learner reading independently, silently reading, lots of material, which is the right level for them. And it seems to me that that definition contains the essentials of extensive reading. From a vocab perspective, I think that around about 98% coverage of the running words in a text is needed for normal extensive reading. And that simply means that about 2 in every 100, or maybe 1 in every 100 words, is an unfamiliar word. Even with that coverage, that still means that there's quite a lot of unfamiliar words around. 98% sounds high, but you know, if you have several thousand words or that in a graded reader, then it still works out to be quite a lot of words. It's also worth bearing in mind that I think there are 2 kinds of extensive reading. One kind of extensive reading is this one with 98% coverage, which is what I call part of the strand of meaning-focused input. And that is, you're gaining input which you're simply concentrating on the message and doing incidental learning. And the other kind of extensive reading is extensive reading for fluency development. And that means where you read material that you've either read before and which is at 100% coverage level for you. There shouldn't really be any unknown words in it. And it also involves reading graded readers which are way below your level, but you read them as fast as you can. And if you accept the principle of the 4 strands, and if you listen to me, you have to accept it, then about 1/3 of the time in an extensive reading course should be spent on reading for fluency, reading really easy material with 100% coverage. And there's a logic behind that 1/3 when you look at the strands. And I don't want to go into that now because it'll get confusing, but it's not just an arbitrary figure. Now, this table is sort of comparing what happens if you try to read without graded readers, and it's sort of showing the purpose from a vocab perspective of graded readers. If you take unsimplified written text, then the first 2,000 word families of English will cover around about 80% of the words. That means 14 out of every 100 words will not be in those 2,000. And then the mid-frequency word families, which is another 7,000 word families, taking up to a total of 9,000, will give you around about 95 or so % coverage. And if you include proper nouns, exclamations, and transparent compounds in that, then you're getting close to 98% coverage. So what that means is that if you didn't use graded readers, then you'd really have to have a vocab size approaching 9,000 words, which is the high frequency words plus the mid frequency words, in order to be comfortable and at ease with extensive reading. So in English, for people learning English, we're really very lucky in that we have this marvelous resource of graded readers available, which allow people to read virtually from the very beginning days of learning English with less than 100 words. You can actually read at a level which is right for you and hopefully gain enjoyment and read with some degree of continuity and fluency by doing it. Because graded readers end at around about the 3,000 word level, I worked along with some very helpful volunteers. We worked on developing what I call mid-frequency readers. And the motivation for mid-frequency readers was that 9% figure that you see in the middle column. That is, if you know the high frequency words, then and you accept that proper nouns and exclamations and those sorts of things are not going to be an issue. That gives you 90% coverage, but that still leaves 10%, one word out of every 10, which is unfamiliar. And if you want to read a novel, 100,000 words long is the average length of a novel in English, then that ends up being a lot of different words because most of those words will be occurring only once. Half of them at least will occur only once, and about 2/3 of them will occur only once or twice. Then the vocab load after finishing graded readers at the 2,000 or 3,000 word level is still very heavy. It's very heavy to read unsimplified readers. So I wanted to see, is it possible, because we now have the computer programs and Word Profiler, which makes adapting these texts much easier. And so I figured we probably need to have about 40 or 50 mid-frequency readers. Unfortunately, we've only got about 14 at the moment, but each reader is simplified to 3 different levels because you can do it at the 4,000 level and go through and just do the additional ones for 6,000 and do it again for 8,000. So it's not too hard to make 3 levels. And you can actually, when you adapt books to be mid-frequency readers, you don't have to make enormous amounts of change. It still takes about a solid day of about probably 6 or 8 hours or more to actually make a mid-frequency reader. But compared to in the old days when we didn't have computers and computer programs to do this, this would be almost a lifetime's work. And so the mid-frequency readers are sort of an attempt to bridge that big gap which exists between the end of the published graded readers and the beginning of unsimplified text. Whether we actually need mid-frequency readers is another question. There are some researchers who think that we probably don't. I can sort of accept their arguments and see, but when I look at the figures of how many words, like, if you're going to read a novel and you only know about 3,000 words, you're going to meet well over 1,000 new words in that novel that you haven't met before and you don't know. And that just seems to me such an enormous burden that you'd have to be really highly motivated to continue with that kind of reading. Anyway, so that's the sort of vocab size requirements and the vocab knowledge requirements. And learners of English are lucky because we do have graded readers and now mid-frequency readers. Now, I tend to be a reductionist. I like to reduce things to their simplest sort of level. And my thinking about vocab learning really says there are only 2 things that really matter in vocabulary learning now, and that is repetition. That is, you have to meet words several times in order to have a good chance of learning them. And then the quality of each meeting will affect the quality of retention of those particular words that you meet. And there's various levels of quality with meeting. And, you know, you can, when you meet a word for the first time, and you might look it up in the glossary or look it up in an online dictionary or something like that, then there'll be some learning that occurs from that. But when you meet the word again, then you have the chance to do retrieval. That is to try and bring back what you remember from your previous meeting with that word. And that retrieval is a slightly deeper quality of processing than you get from the first meeting with the word usually. And so when we look at any vocab learning activity and we want to see, you know, how is vocab learning going to occur, these are the two things I think we really simply have to look for. Is the opportunity for repetition, and are the qualities of meetings with the words during those repetitions deep enough to give some good registration of so that helps the word enter longer term memory. Now, the title of the talk, I think, was something about vocab before and after and during reading or something like that. So if we look at before reading, there are three things which I think are quite important that you can do to help learners be successful at extensive reading. I think the first thing is make sure that learners have enough vocabulary knowledge, and if their vocabulary knowledge is very low, there's a lot to be said for giving deliberate attention to vocabulary using a flashcard program where the word is matched with its translation in the first language, because this kind of learning is enormously effective. One of the most important pieces of research in the last 20 years or more in vocabulary studies for me is a piece of research which was done by one of our PhD students, who's also one of my colleagues, Irina Elgort. And Irina really examines Steve Krashen's idea that deliberate learning is a waste of time because it doesn't establish the kind of knowledge you need for language use. So Steve Krashen's argument is, if you learn things deliberately, yes, you can learn things, but that kind of knowledge is only explicit knowledge. And to use language at a reasonable speed and so on, you actually need implicit knowledge which can be retrieved subconsciously. And Irina's experiment looked at whether vocabulary which was deliberately learned as simply with, you know, the word and the first language translation, whether that deliberate learning resulted in implicit knowledge. And she found that it did. So that meant that deliberately learning vocabulary, and it turns out also multi-word units, establishes both explicit knowledge that you can talk about and think about, and implicit knowledge, which is knowledge where you can respond quickly to something such as retrieve the meaning of a word while you're reading. They are both established at the same time when you do deliberate learning. So Steve Krashen's quite wrong about this. He still believes, I have a feeling in his heart of hearts he doesn't really believe it, but he won't admit that. But it shows then that he's actually wrong about this regarding vocabulary. He's probably right regarding grammar, but I think that with vocabulary, there's now more than one experiment which has shown that deliberate learning establishes implicit knowledge as well as explicit knowledge. Now, the reason for going into this is simply to say, if you're worried about your learners doing deliberate learning using flashcards with first language translations, don't be worried. The research shows that it's a very effective, very efficient activity which establishes the kind of knowledge that you need for normal language use. But if this was the only way that vocabulary was learned in a language course, that would be terrible. And this kind of learning is really what I call language-focused learning, and that should really only make up part of about 1/4 of the time in a language course. And the other 3/4 of the time should be doing meaning message-focused activities like extensive reading, extensive listening, extensive writing. What else? I've missed something, haven't I? Extensive speaking, and doing an extensive viewing, doing those sort of language use activities, and then also developing fluency across the 4 skills. And those things of giving meaning-focused attention to language should make up at least, no, not at least, around about 3/4 of the time in a language course. So my first recommendation is that if your learners do have rather small vocabulary sizes, one way of pushing them on quickly is to get them to do deliberate learning. If you were a student in one of my master's level courses on the teaching and learning of vocabulary, one of the tasks in that course would be to learn 50 words from another language that you've never studied before using word cards, and keep a record of your progress using the word cards. How many words did you know after making your word cards? How many words did you know after the first go through the pack of cards? What words caused you difficulty and all like that. And so my students had to do a task like that. And it invariably blew their minds, because they found that after making the word cards, they could generally retrieve the meanings of about half of the words already. And then by the time they'd been through the cards using spaced learning and various other good learning activities, they only needed about 7 or 8 repetitions in order to know most of the words already. Now, of course, you'd want to put the cards away and then come and look at them a month later and go through them again and do things like that. But enormous amounts of learning can occur in this way, and the learning that results is good, valuable, usable learning. And so if you have any doubts about that, go and have a look at in one of my books, Learning Vocabulary in Another Language, for example. There's a whole chapter on the research on using word cards. The second thing sort of arises out of, it came up yesterday, I think, in Stuart McLean's paper, and that is Wordpart knowledge. It's pretty clear from the research that some learners of English as a foreign language have trouble with English morphology. And it seems to me that it's worthwhile developing word part knowledge, or what in first language studies is often called morphological awareness. And that simply means giving attention, deliberate attention, to prefixes and suffixes and stems, to word part analysis, to using the word part strategy of when you meet a new word, seeing if you can break it into parts and then relate the meaning of the parts to the meaning of the whole word. Unfortunately, most dictionaries don't do this in a helpful way. If you look up a meaning of a word in a dictionary, you'll get often what's a very clear sort of meaning, but it doesn't tell you how that meaning is related to the parts of the word. You can look at an etymology section of a dictionary, but boy, that's like reading another language sometimes, because it gives you all the historical, whether it came from Latin through French and so on like that, and all of that. It's really confusing, but it's possible to make word part knowledge simple and straightforward. And if you look on my website under publications, you'll find that there's an interesting article on word stems by Wei Zhang and I, which gives the 25 most useful word stems, which will give you access to several thousand words from the 2nd to the 10th thousand words of English. So it's really good to develop word part knowledge. And another reason for developing word part knowledge is if learners develop knowledge of word families, and the idea that a word can be a member of family and have related words which are made by adding prefixes and suffixes and so on, but still retaining the same basic meaning of the stem, then this actually increases the opportunity for repetition, because it means each time that you meet a family member, that's actually repeating the whole family, as it were, because you're establishing knowledge which will be able to be applied to other members of the family. So one way then of increasing the repetition of words is simply to develop morphological awareness. I would say that, you know, in a class, if I was teaching a class, say 3 months, a couple of hours or so a week, I'd probably be spending a total of about, probably 3 or 4 hours in total over the whole course on developing morphological awareness. It wouldn't be a one lesson thing that you would do and say, good, I've done that, move on. It'd be something that you would say, well, look, here are some useful prefixes and suffixes to memorize. There's a dozen of them. I'm going to give you a test on it next week. And so you spend about 5 or 10 minutes on that. And there's quite useful little exercises you could do. And then having tested them on the words to make sure that there's parts that they know it, then you start to develop the Wordpart strategy of breaking a word into parts and relating the meaning of the parts to the whole and so on like that. And if you keep coming back to that every couple of weeks or so, over the period of 3 or 4 months, I think you could do a lot to develop a strong morphological awareness. And the third thing that I think could be done before learning, but also during a course, would be helping learners understand the principles of learning. The principles of learning have been things which have really interested me for quite a long time. I started to get really interested in looking at learning principles when I was teaching a course on language curriculum design. And if you're going to design a course, you need to sort of figure out what principles of learning you need to apply in that course and how you're going to apply them. And so I ended up making a list of 20 principles which were well based on research findings, and then kept checking them out over the years. It's interesting too. Very few course books actually teach learners how to learn. I think that's one of the big gaps in course books, and that is, the course books give you material to learn, but they don't explain to the learner how you should go about learning. Now, about a year or two ago, I fell over on my piece of land outside here. You can probably see through the window, I'm not sure. And I hurt my shoulder. So I went to the physiotherapist. And the physiotherapist I went to was a very good one, excellent physiotherapist. And he'd actually been a physiotherapist for the All Blacks and some other famous sports teams in New Zealand. And I got talking to him, and then he asked me where I came from. So I told him the name of my hometown. He said, oh, I've got a friend from there. And I said, oh, who is it? And he told me his name. I said, oh, that's my nephew. And it turned out that this guy, who's a physiotherapist, used to work for telecom. So he was a technician for telecom. And as a technician, he had to attend courses. And in one of the courses he attended, the person teaching the course said, here's what I want you to learn. And here are some ways you can go about learning. And so the teacher of the course gave them a little bit of instruction of how to go about the learning. Now, the information that the teacher gave them wasn't that great. It was things like, write it on a post-it card, write this fact on a post-it card and stick it in front of your toilet so that whenever you go to the toilet, you can look at this piece of knowledge, and stick some on the refrigerator. It was sort of things like that. It actually wasn't great principles of learning, but this guy did it. And he said, when I was at secondary school, he said, I thought I was dumb because I was getting low marks in all the subjects. And then when this guy showed me what to do, I did quite well. And so when he became redundant from telecom, He thought, well, I'm going to, I think if I go and study, I'll do quite well. And so he went and studied physiotherapy. And it really changed his life. So here's the teacher teaching him a few not very good principles, but at least saying, here's how you should go about learning. And it had an enormous effect on this person, because these principles of learning, if they're good principles, you can apply them to any sort of learning that you do. And so I think it's really useful to get learners to understand how to go about learning. So when they're doing extensive reading, they should know how extensive reading will help them and what they can do to get the most from extensive reading. And we're going to look at those principles later on. So I'll come back to a rather short list of principles. Now, let's come back to morphological awareness. So morphological awareness can involve these different things. So the first thing is learning the spoken and written forms and meanings of the most useful prefixes, suffixes, and stems. If you add up the total number of items you'd have to learn, it probably comes to less than about 50. So it's not a lot to learn, but they are very, very helpful things to learn. The second thing with developing morphological awareness is learning how to recognize these forms in words, because the forms of prefixes, suffixes, and stems change according to what's added to them and their immediate context. So in some cases, it's very easy to recognize that something's got ness or ly on the end, but in other cases, you have to be a bit cunning and get a bit of practice in learning how to recognize. The third thing is what I call the Wordpart strategy, is learning to see how the meanings of the parts of words contribute to the meaning of the whole. I think that this meaning in parts thing also applies to multi-word units. And this is why I tend to regard the learning of multi-word units as something which is different from the learning of single word vocabulary items. Because I think when you learn multi-word units, you actually should be looking at how the parts relate to the whole, and that's a different kind of learning. And I think that you can apply the same kind of part-whole strategy to the learning of single words. And number 4, learning to recognize word parts, even though there's been some changes to the forms of the parts. The most difficult ones are things like in, the prefix in, which can become il, ir, and so on and that. But there's not many which cause problems. The fifth thing is learning that words make up word families that have a common stem and share a common meaning as a part of their full meaning. And I think that this idea of word families is quite important, because it's clear that learners have trouble with this. And yet this knowledge seems to me to be really important for dealing with new word forms that are met and related to known ones, and also for getting repetition. And then number 6, I've got learning the word part strategy for remembering complex words, and that's really the same as number 3. So that's what I mean by morphological awareness. So that's a sort of rough syllabus that you could sort of follow if you wanted to work on this with your learners. Now, principles of learning. These are what I think are the most important applicable principles of learning that both teachers and learners should know about. I think that course books for learners of English should include these principles of learning. There should be a little section in each lesson which says, you know, this course book is designed this way because we want to cover the 4 strands, you know, meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and fluency development. And there should be little explanations so that people can learn these things. And I think that these principles, which I'm going to relate to vocabulary learning, but also apply to many, many different kinds of learning. Even if you learn to drive a car, there are principles which are very similar to these that you can apply. if you want to learn to drive a car, it's quite useful to observe somebody driving a car, to be the passenger and get meaning-focused input by watching them doing the driving and seeing, do they look in the rear vision mirror and all of this sort of thing, and what do they do, and that. And it's also important, of course, meaning-focused output, that you actually drive the car. But it's also important that through language-focused learning, that you actually understand something about the nature of cars and what makes cars go and things like that, so that you can actually deal with difficulties as they occur. So the principles of the 4 strands is a very important principle for me. I think that, a well-balanced language course should have 4 strands. If you want to learn vocabulary, you should learn vocabulary through meaning-focused input, through extensive reading and extensive listening. You should learn vocabulary through through meaning-focused output, that is through writing and speaking. And you should deliberately study vocabulary through language-focused learning. And you should also develop fluency with the vocabulary that you know. And I think, for me, that's a very important principle. The second principle is the cost-benefit principle, and that is that you should make sure that at any time you are learning something which is the most useful thing for you to learn at that time. And for me, word frequency is a very good guide to usefulness for vocabulary. You should be learning the high-frequency words before the low-frequency words. You should be learning the mid-frequency words before the low-frequency words. You should be learning vocabulary which has immediate application in areas of specialist interest for you. And so it's really important then to make sure that the vocab which is being learnt is not stuff that's not going to be of no benefit to you later, but vocabulary which is going to give you the most return for your learning effort. And then we have the principle of repetition, and that is, if you want to learn something, meet it and deal with it and use it several times. The holy grail in vocabulary research is, how many definitions do we need for learning? It's a question that's not easy to answer because there are so many factors affecting word difficulty. But the minimum generally seems to be about 7 or 8, and the more, the better. The principle of spaced retrieval is a very well-researched and well-established principle. There must be several hundred pieces of research on that. And that simply says, if you want to remember something for a long time, then you should make sure that your meetings with this, or the repetitions with this material, is not all massed together at one time, but is spaced over several days, weeks, and months. And it's important then that you don't work away at something and do mass repetition, but that you do spaced repetition and spend roughly about the same amount of time. Varied meetings. So that principle simply says, if we want something to stick in our memory, the more kinds of associations and the richer the kind of knowledge we have of it, the better the retention will be. Deliberate attention. That simply says that if we focus on something deliberately, then we have a greater chance of learning it. If we compare deliberate learning, deliberate attention, to incidental attention, deliberate attention wins every time. But the trouble with deliberate attention is that it doesn't always give you a lot of help with language use. And so it's important then to have the 4 strands so that you give some deliberate attention to vocabulary, but you also have plenty of opportunities for incidental attention. And then the focus of attention is a very important principle developed by a guy called Joe Barcroft. And in its simplest form, it simply says, we learn what we focus on. So if we focus on the spelling of words, we will learn the spelling of words. If we focus on the meaning of words, we will learn the meaning of words. And whatever we focus on takes our attention away from the things that we don't focus on. And so if you focus on the meaning of words, you might get poor knowledge of the form of words. If you focus on the form of words, you might not develop knowledge of the meaning of words. And so it's always interesting then when you look at vocabulary activities to see where is the learner's focus directed, and is this direction where I want the learning to occur. The time on task principle is a very crude principle. It's simply a quantity principle. And it says, if you want to learn something, spend time on doing that. So if you want to learn to read, read. If you want to learn to write, write. If you want to learn to speak, speak. And this is a very crude principle, but it's a principle which always works. So if you want to become good readers, do a lot of reading. If you want to become good at speaking, do a lot of speaking. And when in doubt, and you're not sure what to do, just simply do a lot of what you really need to learn. And then the last principle I've got here is what I've talked about already, and that's learner autonomy. It's important that learners should understand why and how learning occurs, what helps learning, and they should be able to look and actually monitor their own learning so that they can improve the learning conditions for themselves. I've just been watching the Olympics. So for about 2 weeks, not a lot of work was done on other things, and I spent a lot of time watching the Olympics. And in the late 1950s and 60s, New Zealand had a lot of medal-winning middle-distance runners. There were people like Peter Snell and Murray Halberg and John Walker, who were great at Dick Quacks, who were great middle-distance runners and who won gold medals and silver medals at the Olympics. And their coach was a guy called Arthur Lydiard. And Arthur Lydiard's, one of his principles was, whenever you train people in the sports, you should explain to them why they are doing certain activities. So if you're making them do lots of running up steep hills and carrying heavy weights on their back while they do the running, they should know the reason for doing that. And he says, if you can explain, if they can understand the reason why they're doing it, you get much more work out of them. They'll see the purpose of it, and they'll apply themselves much better to it. Now, I think this is really important for extensive reading. When learners do extensive reading, it shouldn't just be by magic you will learn. They should understand how extensive reading helps learning, what principles of learning are being applied in extensive reading. Because then if they understand those principles, that's a way of then getting them more motivated. Now, one of the big problems with extensive reading is learners' motivation. And when you have a sort of complex problem like this, it seems to me that you really need to deal with a complex problem by looking at a range of solutions to the problem rather than looking for one solution. And when I was looking at extensive reading and motivation, one sort of framework which helps to deal with this, try to deal with this issue of learner motivation is a framework of cognitive, affective, and situational. And so if you explain to learners how graded reading will help them, and how graded reading applies principles which helps their learning, then that's taking a cognitive approach to getting them engaged with doing graded reading. So it's through understanding and knowledge that you try and get them hooked onto graded reading. But there are also situational approaches to motivating people. And I think Akio Furukawa's extensive reading courses that I've been to observe in Shinjuku are a very good example of this. And the situational approach is simply saying, it's the same as what Atsuko Takase uses too. Here is the time to read. You are at the class, sit down and read. And so the situation says there is nothing to do but read, so let's do it. And that seems to work very effectively too. And then there's the affective approach to it. And that's one that simply refers to feelings. And that's getting learners to enjoy graded reading, to enjoy being in the class which has graded reading. And that is also an approach to dealing with motivation. So the reason I mention this is simply to say that getting learners understanding principles is just one way out of many that you should apply to try and motivate learners to do extensive reading. Now, let's look at the principles, how they apply to extensive reading. Now, clearly repetition will apply, because by doing lots of graded readers, you're reading lots of graded readers, you'll meet the same vocabulary several times. But when we look at quality of learning, okay, so remember what I consider the two essentials for vocab learning, repetition and quality of processing, then these three things here are three levels of quality of processing that I think occur during extensive reading. The first one is noticing, and that is when you guess from context, or you look up a dictionary or consult a glossary or something like that, then you're actually giving some noticing, deliberate attention to the word, and that will help learning. The second thing which occurs during extensive reading is retrieval. And that means when you meet a word that you haven't met before, when you meet a word that you've met before, you have a chance to retrieve your previous knowledge from previous meetings. And the great thing about extensive reading is that there are varied meetings. If you do a concordance of words in a graded reader, you will find that the same word might occur several times, but typically the context in which it occurs are different each time. So this means that extensive reading allows learners to meet the same words in varied contexts. And meeting in varied contexts is a fairly deep way of a deep quality involved in helping remember words. So I think this is why extensive reading works for vocabulary learning, because it provides repetition, it provides noticing, it provides opportunity for retrieval, and it deepens the quality of processing through varied meetings with the word. Okay. Now, if we want to look at extensive reading, how can we, while learners are doing extensive reading, how can we help vocab learning? The first way is simply do lots of extensive reading, because then the things I've looked at already of repetition, quality of processing, then have plenty of chance to occur. You can add a deliberate learning element to extensive reading by putting unknown words onto flashcards or into flashcard programs. And with graded readers, this is a very good thing to do, because just about every word in a graded reader is worth learning. Look up some words. There's debate about whether learners should use dictionaries when they do extensive reading. There's no doubt in my mind that learners should use dictionaries. The research shows clearly that looking up words when you meet them helps memory for those words. Now, you shouldn't look up too many words, because if you're looking up too many words, you've chosen a graded reader which is probably too difficult for you. So it's really, you don't want dictionary lookup or consulting the glossary through a hyperlink or something like that to really take over graded reading. So looking up some words is the way to go. But if your book is at the right level, that's not an issue. reread some books. The reason for rereading is that you then get a spaced repetition, a spaced retrieval of the words that you've already met before. So this increases the opportunity for retrieval. It also increases the opportunity for developing fluency. So that's yet another reason, a good reason to do rereading. Do a speed reading course, and also do easy extensive reading with a focus on speed. If we compare the effects of targeted speed reading courses with easy extensive reading, it seems that targeted speed reading courses give a faster reading speed increase than easy extensive reading. But I don't see them as being in competition with each other. I see them being as two things which you should include both. But it really is worth including a speed reading course. If you've never had your learners do a speed reading course, then have a look on my website. There's a whole pile of speed reading courses at the 500 word level, 1,000 word level, 2,000 plus academic word list. There's about 6 different speed reading courses developed largely by one of my colleagues, Sonia Millett, and they're all free and available for anybody who wants to use them. And I understand Paul Goldberg's going to include them in his X-reading program too, which is great. And then the other thing to do while extensive reading is to get learners to reflect on the new words that they met during the reading. This reflection is really a spaced retrieval, provides an opportunity for spaced retrieval, and provides an opportunity for deliberate attention. Okay, that's it, folks. I think I've covered all the things that I want to cover. I want to stress this thing of principles in conclusion, and that is, nowadays when I read new research, one of the things that I do is when I read the research, I say, does this research agree or disagree with the principles that I generally work on for language learning? And it's really interesting to see that, in fact, most of the research doesn't lead me to have to change the principles. The first list of principles that I made for a course on curriculum design, which would be in the probably around about 1990 or something like that. You didn't realize I was that old. That first list of principles hasn't really changed very much over the years. I had a chance to revise the language curriculum design book last year, and we only really changed one principle in the book as a result of that revision. So these principles are pretty good ones, and they seem to have stood the test of time. So I'd recommend to you that you come to an understanding of these principles. There's plenty of places where you can read about them. And I think that your learners should know them as well, because these principles apply not only to vocabulary learning, but also to many other kinds of learning. I shall now stop and give you a chance to ask easy questions.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for your plenary speech. There were actually 2 or 3 questions that came up in the chat while you were speaking. So okay. If I could relay them to you.
Yeah.
So from Ichi, there was the question. So Paul, there's a case, although my students seem to enjoy extensive reading and they get something through it, but as we know that most students, they still prefer to use Google Translate because they think it's easier and more effective. Now, as a teacher, I don't want them to use it. How do I make them learn vocabulary more through ER than through Google Translate?
Yeah, well, this is where you could go to the principle of the 4 strands. because if you're getting your learners to actually understand these principles, then Google Translates fits into the language-focused learning strand of the 4 strands. Extensive reading fits into the meaning-focused input strand of the 4 strands. So I've got no problems with learners using Google Translate. I actually like grammar translation. I think grammar translation is a reasonable sort of activity. But it should only be taking up a very small part of the course, about a quarter of 1/4 of a course, about a quarter of the language-focused learning strand. And so it's really important that the learners are not relying just on one kind of opportunity for learning, but they're getting a balanced set of opportunities so that they can actually use the language. And so I would take a cognitive approach there and say, here are some principles, let's see how they apply, and in what you're doing here, you're actually not meeting one of the principles. And so we could then have a general talk about that.
All right, thank you very much. Did that answer your question, Echi?
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for the answer. No.
Okay.
Okay, and I have one more from Kasai. And that's, are there differences of effectiveness between, say, word cards versus a vocabulary book, or ready-made word cards versus self-made word cards, or paper word cards versus using some kind of online app?
Yeah. Well, one of the Temple University students has done research on the effects of actually making word cards. And if I remember it correctly, he found that making the word cards helped learning. But if ready-made word cards were available, this actually saved time, and and if you use that time that you would have used for making for more repetition and so on, that would have been probably better off. I'm all in favor of electronic flashcards. My only problem is that there's quite a lot of electronic flashcard programs, and several of them are made by people who know about computing and programming, but who don't know about vocabulary learning. And there's a very nice article by Tatsuya Nakata, 2011, I think it's one of the Cal journals. You can find a reference on my website. I put up a big vocabulary database there, and you can just search for Nakata 2011 for the reference. And Tatsuya developed a list of criteria for evaluating a flashcard program. And the criteria were based on research. So they looked at things like, spacing the repetitions, the opportunity for retrieval, and all of these sorts of things. And he outlines all the principles, and he evaluated some of the programs. I think Anki came out very high, and I think I Know, little I, capital K-N-O-W, came out very high as well. And so if your learners are using flashcard programs, I think it'd be quite good to sort of to work out which were the better of the flashcard programs. But learners, if they know the principles of learning, should actually be able to evaluate flashcard programs themselves. But I think flashcard programs are great.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
About the flashcard. I teach at 4th graders and 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and I have students draw a picture, and I make a picture flashcard. Well,
Yeah.
the reason is, if you, the university students, high school and university students have a very difficulty reading without translation. So to get out of that translation habit, they have to start from the very beginning, very easy books. But when the students, 4th and elementary school students, when they draw pictures and every week they learn 15 about 15. And in 1 year, they learned 600 to 1,000 because they draw the pictures by their own. So very, very unique pictures. They learn a lot, or automatically they learn. And then for the first 2 years, I had students draw pictures, and there were lots of cards. So on the third year, I used those cards to the students. Then the learning vocabulary was not score. I didn't get it. I didn't give the test, but I felt that the student didn't learn as much as before. So now I get back to the new student that I'm having student drawing picture. And then I would like them to learn the words through picture, not Japanese, not translation, especially for the beginning. And then they can read English books. They imagine the pictures, and also they learn to read the backside. It was spelled out. So they learn both pictures and spelling, but not Japanese. They know apple. If they see apples, they don't say ringo, but they can read apples. And when they speak, it's easier for them to use English. That's what I found for the several years, especially for the elementary school children. So
I got two comments on that. One comment is I've been looking at the research on glossing, and because now with electronic reading, I mean, electronic reading is fantastic. I don't read hard copy novels anymore. I just read through Kindle, and in fact, I'm sure my vocabulary has grown because I live in a very small house. It's smaller than a Japanese house, and I don't have room for a big dictionary. And but now when you just touch the word, you get the meaning. Oh, fantastic. This is brilliant. And I understand too that there are now apps and programs where you can put your material into this program so that you can then just touch on words and get immediate access to the meaning. I mean, this is just tremendous. Now, the work on glossing shows that pictures do help learning. They found that you shouldn't get too elaborate in the sense of having pictures and translations and definitions. They found that a maximum of 2 ways of giving the meaning is easy enough, and one's probably enough. So certainly there's evidence for that. The problem with glossing is that if you have pictures, it often can take learners' attention away from word form, but I still don't think that's a big issue. The other issue is about thinking in the first language or second language. I think from my reading of the research and probably my own experience is that it's almost unavoidable that learners will, at least in the early stages of language learning, relate vocabulary to their first L2 vocabulary to their first language, because the lexical stores for foreign and first languages are shared in the early and intermediate stages of language proficiency. So I think whether you want it or not, it's going to happen that words are going to be related to their first language meanings. It takes quite a development of proficiency before the lexical stores are separated, and that there's a separate lexical store for words for the second language. So all I would say then with pictures is that you'd have to make sure that the picture, if they're drawing the pictures, that's good because they know what the pictures mean. If you're providing pictures, then you might be introducing an element of possible miscommunication, and you got to be a little bit careful for that. But I'm not so fussed about learners thinking in the first language. I think it's a proficiency issue rather than a learning means issue.
Okay, and it seems like this discussion is getting even more kind of vivacious. I can see the chat starting to really light up, but let's take about a 10-minute break in